Today, Jordan Silverman of Starfish joins us once again to provide insights into benchmarking in the state of the industry. And I will tell you right now, things look interesting and not in a good way. So today, as I mentioned, we're joined by Jordan Silverman, who is the CEO of Starfish, one of our partners. Starfish provide essentially AI analysis software for financials for the restaurant industry and the bar industry. And because of that, they have a lot of great benchmarking data. So every quarter we get together, we talk through it and just kind of go about the state of the industry. So first of all, Jordan, thank you so much for being here again for one of these benchmarking reviews.
It's been really fun the last couple. I love these conversations. I think I learned just as much from you as the audience hopefully learns from Starfish.
Well, I know everyone learns a lot from you because usually when I'm talking, it's just BS. You come here with hard data. So that always helps. And real quick, before we dive into this, how are things going at Starfish?
Things have been going really well. As you could expect, the quality of this data is getting significantly better because we are adding more customers. So just to take everyone a little bit behind the scenes, but basically what we're doing is ingesting all of the data that we have, anonymizing it and normalizing it and seeing trends over time. And I'm excited to say that if we look at Q4 2024 versus Q1, Q2, Q3, we've got a lot more customers, which should mean better data because less outliers.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think we've mentioned every time we discuss data is that as you get more customers, this is going to balance out. But especially early on, we're getting customers that cared about their accounting. So some of our numbers might have been a little outlier. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't even thinking this, but I said, some of these numbers don't look great. We do see a decline in some numbers. That could in and of itself be part of it.
It absolutely could be part of it because I think when you have a handful of clients versus a lot of handfuls of clients, as we do now, numbers can get skewed by one really good month, one really bad month, or good or bad quarters. There's no perfect system, and that's just part of benchmarking. What I would stress to the audience, Chris, is as we talk about things, benchmark should be looked at directionally, not exact. These are trends, not exact numbers. The numbers are less important than the trends that are happening, and you want to listen to this so you can learn from the trends and understand what is the broader audience doing. What we hear a lot about is, how am I doing? And that's really what this should help you answer. How are you doing?
Absolutely. So just as a reminder, as we get into these, the way that we look at this data, it is divided between major cities or major markets, if you will, and non-major cities. So we take and separate that out just because, as I've said many times on this podcast, if you're in rural Kansas, that's a heck of a lot different than being in New York City. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in it. And first thing we want to talk through is just net profits. And for all of this, or for net profits, we have numbers for both the top performers and for the industry average. So in top performers, we saw in our major markets at 17.2%, and in non-major markets, 8.25% among the top folks. To be honest, that's showing a decreasing trend. 33% in Q2 in major cities, down to 21.6, now down to 17.2. When we look at those non-major cities, went from 37% in Q2 to 29.6, now 20.25. So something here is tightening that up. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at the average, we see basically the same thing. And it's dropping. There was a little bit more oscillation in the average throughout the year than in just the top performers. But the average has gone in major cities from 10.4% Q2 to negative 1% this last quarter, which is not good. And in non-major cities from 21.4 down to 2.55. We saw in the non-major cities a little bit of a recovery in Q3 that is now gone. Now that might be what insulated them and gave them a positive average profit margin. But Jordan, just looking at kind of the net profits and this downward trend we've seen throughout the year, what are your thoughts?
I think there's a lot of talk in the industry about tightening margins. And the first thing I want to say is it's real. We are seeing this both quantitatively and qualitatively from our customers that running a profitable business, running a profitable restaurant is hard. And I'm not breaking news by saying that. tightening is actually happening. What I would say is that there are two ways to increase profitability. Number one, dump more cash on top, add more revenue. Number two, look at every single line of the P&L, which is what Chris and Starfish do so well, because there's two things, and you have to focus on both of those things at the same time.
And I think, too, that this may be an indication that more people need to look at something like zero-sum budgeting, right? Yeah, I have the money to spend, but can I justify every expense? And as things tighten, every penny becomes more important, right? And you have to always look at, is this money I'm spending actually generating revenue that pays for itself?
Chris, can I interrupt for 1 second? I have a question for you as the expert. We're talking early February here. I had a call today, 2-location client, okay? They asked, why should they build a budget for this year? How would you answer that question? Why is budgeting important?
If you don't budget, it's kind of like, I'm just going to guess my way through this. And at the end of the day, budgets and forecasting, let's be honest, you're rarely that accurate because you're taking a guess and there are too many factors to put into play there. And, you and I could just talk about why net profits are down on average for 5 hours because there are so many different potential factors that could be, 0.5% of that or 0.25% of that. But in general, I would say if you don't budget, A, put yourself in a position where you're likely to overspend. And B, if you don't budget, you don't know what's going wrong until it's too late, right? You need something. And that's like with Starfish. One of the things I like about what you guys do. Oh, your linen cost went up 50% this month. Yes, linen cost is a tiny expense for most people on a percentage basis. But if that happens across 4 items and you don't notice it because you're not budgeting and paying attention, that may be how you go from a 5% profit to a negative 1% profit.
And we talked about margins and how thin they are. I just want to walk through this example. So this 2-location I was talking about before, we ran through and we built a budget for 2025. If their sales increase 5% and their costs decrease 1%. Now, doing both those at the same time is not easy. I recognize that. But that's literally the difference between losing 100 breaking even. 5% increase in revenue and a 1% decrease in costs. The little tweaks are literally the difference between the net incomes that we're talking about here of -1, 5, 10. It's little small actions that can make a huge ripple effect.
And it also is relying on your prime cost and your controllable costs and hoping you don't get beat up too much on your non-controllable costs. And I think we're seeing a lot of pressure, and this actually segues really well into our next data point, but we're seeing a lot of pressure on those non-controllable costs, whether it's insurance or occupancy costs. And the occupancy costs are out of all the numbers that we're looking at today, those are the ones that slapped me in the face hard. Because if we look at rent plus utilities in major cities went from 6.4 Q1 to 11 Q2 to 14 Q3 to 15.5 Q4. And in non-major cities, it's been a little bit better, but we saw basically 5% Q1, and then we've been at 11, 12% since. So, and in major cities, I also want to point out that 12.5% occupancy cost, that's 15.5% rather occupancy cost, is made up of 12.5% of just straight rent. So, and you have better insight here than I do, but when we're looking at that rent number being so much higher than it was a few quarters ago, is that decreasing revenue or increasing rent?
Yes, that's the simple answer. Yes, it is both. We saw revenue overall dip in Q4 compared to prior quarters and year over year. But I had a bar owner down here in Miami recently tell me that he's scared to get his renewal. He thinks he'll be lucky if it goes up only 20%. He thinks his rent is only going to go, he thinks he'll be lucky if his rent only goes up 20% in Miami. I was talking to a bar group CFO, and they're in expansion mode. And he basically said that there's 2 types of properties. There's the easy to get properties, And there's the really competitive properties that you know are in a great location. And if you can get one of those, hold on to it for dear life. But that's also why we're seeing these rent increases happen, is because people realize they can charge a lot for those great properties.
Now, as you say that, and we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but one of the things that strikes me is we're not seeing, I mean, a huge return to work still, right? We still have a lot of people working from home. A lot of these downtown properties that are key, great properties don't have the foot traffic they had 5 years ago, but now they're charging way more. So do you think that's a sustainable thing? I mean, do you think we're going to see people go back to work and make up for what the restaurants can do for lunch? Or are you just going to pay through the ass and still lose money every day on lunch?
I think rent increases are really hard for two reasons. Number one, I don't need to tell the audience that food and labor is increasing. It's a fact. Food and labor is increasing. The hard part is when the non-controllables like rent also start to increase. That's really difficult. And that just means that you need to pay extra attention to everything else. So I think the first thing from a rent standpoint, as you alluded to, Chris, is revenue decreasing means that the percentage of rent increases. That's hard. So the best thing you can do to lower your rent as a percentage of sales is increase sales. I know that sounds counter and pretty obvious, but then the second thing I would say is just like, if you're in a great property, you kind of just have to eat it and keep going and figure out other places to improve, which is unfortunate because when you're looking at 10 or 15% of your income just going out the door in a non-controllable way, that's hard to stomach.
Well, and tell me what your feeling is on this, because I go back and forth on this in my own head. We constantly are still seeing prices increase, right? Not near as much as they were before. And food inflation for 24 was basically half of food inflation for 23. But these effects are still happening. And I feel like we're getting to the point where, and this probably explains a lot of what's going on, especially in the non-major cities. You can't just keep increasing your prices. People are over that shit.
I think realistically, almost any restaurant or bar can get away with a 5 to 10% increase in prices.
Mm-hmm.
I think where it gets really hard is when you start to price yourself out of the market.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it gets really hard because at some point the consumer looks, and I see this happen all the time, where what they'll do is they'll look at the menu on their phone and they'll see one price. And they go to the restaurant or to the bar later that day and it's $2 higher. That's a really bad customer experience, right? But updating your menus in real life, online, on social, and all of these different places is really hard. So that's why it's challenging. It is, but you have to do it smartly. You got to plan it if you're going to increase prices.
Absolutely. One thing, and we'll talk about this as we get into prime cost here, but one thing I wonder is if some of this divergence between major and non-major markets isn't certain people increased prices and certain people didn't. But just to put some context around this. So when we look at prime costs, and we'll break this down piece by piece, but just overall prime costs in major cities, we started the year out at, went down to 56, up to 64.5. Now we're at 61. So kind of been just oscillating in that high 50, low 60 range all year. No major change. Now where we do see more of a major change on prime cost is in the non-major markets. Started the year off at 57.8, second quarter 53, third quarter back up to 58. So not much movement there, but then we've seen now for Q4 62.25. So was kind of in that mid-50s range and now it's just bumped up. Do you have any ideas on why we would see major market prime cost stay pretty narrow, really? And then non-major cities, we've just seen this bump up in Q4.
Yeah. First thing I'm going to say is I have a feeling this is partially our data being a little bit skewed, where what we're seeing is that a lot of our multi-unit groups are in major cities and a lot of our non-multi-unit groups are in non-major cities. And the reason that can skew data is because we're seeing the multi-locations really start to pressure the suppliers for better pricing, whereas the single locations can't do that. So first thing I'm going to say is I do have a feeling that this is qualitatively a skew in the data. Second thing I'll say is if you are in a non-major city, there's no reason to take your price list to a new supplier and get them to price it out. The goal is not necessarily to get a new supplier. The goal is to then go back to your old supplier and say, these are the prices I have from your competitor. I want to stay with you, but I need you to beat the rate. Now, if you're already doing that, kudos to you, but I promise you, even if you are just one location, it will work. Will it work on every item? No. Will you be able to lower your prime cost a couple percent? 100% you will. Yes.
Absolutely. It reminds me of when I had my bar, because I never used Cisco. I always use this local company called McFarling in Indiana. But I talked to Cisco about switching to them every year. And every year they were willing to cut me deals. And every year I handed their sheet to McFarling, and McFarling went, oh, no, we can match that.
Every year, though, right?
Every single year.
And we're not, like Chris and I, we're not talking about like lower quality. We're not talking about worse customer service. That's not what we're talking about. We are simply talking about leveraging a competitor for better prices. It is a couple hours of work, a no-brainer. Almost every supplier has an online portal that you can log into and see how much you're paying for specific items. It's worth spending a couple hours doing.
And to your point, yeah, we're not even talking about different products, right? I mean, Hidden Valley Ranch is Hidden Valley Ranch regardless of who I buy it from.
Yeah.
You know, Frank's Red Hot is Frank's Red Hot. Sweet Baby Ray's is Sweet Baby Ray's. Hormel meat is Hormel meat. Like, we're not talking small brands. We're not talking store brands. We're talking just the big players, absolutely identical.
Yeah. Now, Chris, I'm curious for your thoughts on the like bar side. What are your thoughts on like using different items from a product mix standpoint? Like if I'm making an old fashioned or a margarita, like what are your thoughts on just using different types of liquor for the best possible margin, depending on what you can buy at the time? Not necessarily worse quality, just a different kind.
So we're in bars, a lot of times you can run into things where, like, okay, say we're talking, I don't know, just vodka. Right? Vodka is relatively interchangeable. Let's be honest here. Right now, Tito's is hard to beat for price and quality, and that's real. Honestly, I'm a vodka drinker. I drink Tito's, but Tito's is not that much better or worse than Sky or Sobieski or a handful of other ones that you can kind of put in there. So I think changing the actual vodka mid-drink list is a bad idea, because if I know that you have a mule on your list with Tito's and then it's not Tito's, I'm going to kind of go, what the fuck? But if you change your menu like on a seasonal basis or on a monthly basis, heck yeah, I can get a 5 case deal on this other vodka that's basically as good. Yeah, I'm going to buy those 5 cases and I'm going to switch my menu. Switch it out for an item, do a different cocktail, and enjoy that cost savings. And I think especially on liquor, that becomes hugely important, because the volume deals on liquor change drastically month to month, way more so than food. So let's break down prime cost a little bit here real quick. So I thought it was really interesting. Food costs we've seen go up across the board. But in major markets, we're looking at about 3 points. In non-major markets, we're looking at about 10 points. So from 25% to 35%. Now, I think to your point, probably some of that is if the major markets are your larger clients, they have better buying power, they have more stable prices. I also wonder, in the way some of this prime cost data looks as we go through it, if in larger cities they didn't raise prices a little bit, and if in smaller cities they didn't, because that would, if there's inflation, you don't raise prices, your prices or cost on a percentage basis is going to go up a lot more. But do you have any particular insights on why you'd see that 10% jump in food cost in non-major markets?
One of the things that was really interesting is we actually saw food sales increase pretty significantly as a percentage of the product mix, right? So if you're thinking about 100% of your sales, we saw food make up a larger piece of that pie in Q4 compared to prior periods. What happens a lot of times when sales are increasing like that is over ordering, waste, over portioning, different things like that. So I have a feeling that it was less about like price increases and more about not necessarily being ready for a food increase. And when you're not necessarily ready for when you're not necessarily ready for an increase in food sales, you inevitably have more waste and poor planning.
And that would make a lot of sense. Because if we look at wine, because wine is the only one here that's just seen this stupid reduction in cost percentage. And I would say if food sales, we think it's because they're ordering more and over ordering and waste. I think the wine sales, we're seeing a huge decrease in cost percentage because people had inventory and just burnt through it and didn't replace it.
We're hearing this a lot from our customers. Sorry, Chris. We're
Are
hearing this
you?
a lot from our customers of like giving up their wine buys and their wine slots and instead just depleting inventory. It's one of the things that we're seeing our customers do the most to combat like that tightening of net income is just focusing on, instead of buying new wine, let's go through what we have.
So to give everybody listening just the numbers real quick, wine cost in major markets from Q3 to Q4 went from 41% to 16%. And in non-major markets went from 58% to 28%. So you got a 25% drop in major markets, a 30% drop in non-major markets. And if it just is, we're not buying it and we're selling it and just drawing down our stock, makes perfect sense. Now, what I wonder is, and since you're hearing from people, they are drawing down that stock, are they also telling you that they're just selling less wine as a whole?
We do see seasonality to wine sales. So yes, we see like a decrease in wine sales quarter over quarter, but we don't necessarily see a decrease in wine sales year over year.
Okay. So this is more just managing inventory turnover than anything else.
Most likely.
Okay. Yeah. Which that's good. I mean, it's a lot of places sit on a lot of wine. They don't necessarily need to.
So true. So true.
So switching from wine, let's take a look at beer here real quick. In beer, we have a different story in major and non-major markets. In major markets, we went from 18.75 down to 16.66. So, basically a 2% decrease in beer costs. In non-major markets, saw an increase from 17 to 20, so a 3% increase. Neither one of those, I think, is particularly noteworthy. But have you been hearing anything about beer?
To me, that's more like things are going in the same direction for beer, right? Like, I think it's natural that a couple percentage might change as the data set changes, as time changes. So for me, I have not been hearing a ton about beer. I've been hearing a lot about food, wine, liquor, but it seems like beer is beer, and it's pretty status quo there.
Hey, if beer is beer and it's status quo there, and we're looking at 16 to 20% cost, right? So it's a 5 for 1. That's great for everybody that serves a lot of beer.
Mm-hmm.
But you said you've heard more about liquor. So let's look at liquor real quick. Liquor we saw the same thing with beer, all small changes, but in opposite directions. Major markets went from 29.5% average liquor cost down to 26.66. Non-major markets went from 33% up to 36%. So major markets came down 3%. Smaller markets went up 3%. So what have you been hearing about liquor?
We're hearing in Q4 that liquor sales were up pretty significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw a fair amount of stocking up on the liquor side.
Okay.
So we heard that
inventory reduction in wine was replaced by additional inventory in liquor.
Most likely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that would explain the non-major markets going up a little bit because they're overbuying and stocking up. And you said liquor sales in Q4, from what you've heard from all your folks, were up pretty much across the board.
We're seeing that from a data standpoint. Yeah, liquor sales have increased in Q4 2024.
Very interesting. It'll be interesting to see if because if beer costs at 20% is, if that's where the average is, that's phenomenal. That liquor cost at 36% in non-major markets is not realistically sustainable for a long period of time.
Yeah. I think a lot of this also has to do with, as you said, inventory control, where one of the good and bad things about our data set is we're reliant on the financial data. And we do see a lot of our customers take month-end inventory counts to offset that. We also see a lot that don't. So what happens is when they're not taking month-end inventory counts of liquor and wine and beer, when you stock up in a month or quarter, it really skews the COGS accordingly. And not just for that month or quarter, but overall, realistically.
Absolutely. And just for the record, I know I say this ad nauseum on this podcast. counting is not doing your freaking inventory. You have to reconcile what you used against what you should have used. And if you're not doing that part, none of your numbers mean anything. So, okay, sorry. I'll get off my soapbox real quick. Now, let's talk about the last piece of prime cost here, labor cost. And what's interesting is in major markets, labor cost Q3 to Q4, basically no movement. I mean, we're talking less than a percentage point. Non-major markets, it's up 2.5%, but that could just be staffing more for holidays and then not getting the business, really.
Big change we saw, and listen, it's Q4, it makes sense, is there was such a significant increase in vacation. So we have a lot of customers that are actually booking vacation wages as a line item. It makes sense, it's the holidays, but that increased so significantly compared to prior periods. So as a business owner, you need to be ready for that to come, because you are going to have everyone try to take off at the same time. You know this, but you've got to prepare for that.
And it's interesting because I think vacation time in hospitality is a relatively new thing, like especially on the hourly employee side. This is like the last 10 years this has happened. And it'll be interesting to see if you've seen a lot of people taking time off in December. If next year, as this trend for vacation time grows, we don't see like, no, December's a blacked out month. You don't get to take vacation in December.
Yeah. It's going to be really interesting to watch this and see what happens. I agree.
Yeah. So that, I mean, gets us through all the metrics that we discuss every quarter. So Jordan, do you have any final thoughts on the metrics or any like summarization here that you would like to put on everything?
I'm happy to go first, and I want your thoughts as well. First thing I'll say is, if you are a business owner and you feel like your margins are getting tighter and tighter, you're not alone. You're not doing something wrong. This is what we're seeing across the board. Now, having said that, there are absolutely steps you can take to be more profitable. Step number one, look at that top line revenue and see, all right, am I being good with my marketing spend? How can I get more customers in the door? And then number two, you have to look line by line. And building a 2025 budget is a great way to do that. But I promise you, there are ways to decrease your costs, whether that's with a software or someone like Chris helping you. So again, if your margins are tightening, if you're really stressed about that net income and how much cash is in the bank at the bottom line, you shouldn't be afraid. You shouldn't be scared. You're not alone. This is what we're seeing from a trend standpoint, but you have to start taking proactive steps to improve. Have to.
And I could not agree with that more. The only thing I would add as a final comment here is, too often, I feel like people are looking for wins of a whole percentage point or 2 or 3 or 4 points and don't want to look at the little shit. But I'm sorry, when your average profit margin is negative 1%, if you can make 10 changes that are worth 0.1%, you now don't have to write a check to pay payroll out of your own pocket. And so it's those tiny little things when shit gets tight that make all the difference. And I've said a lot of times the difference between a bar that makes 10% and a bar that makes 20% is 1,000 changes of 0.1%. But in this case, when we start, especially when the squeeze is on, you have to pay absolute attention to every little tiny thing. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. So with that, I guess that'll wrap us up for today. Jordan, any other notes before we let you go?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This is great. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for being here. This is one of my favorite things 4 times a year, just because it's not often that I get to talk with somebody that's just as nerdy about the numbers than me, but also has more insights than I do onto the actual numbers and what's going on across the market as a whole. So again, thank you for being here, and we will see you again next quarter to update these, hopefully with a slightly better outlook on the market as a whole, not talking about another declining quarter.